In a small town in the Midwest where life moved slowly and days blended into one another, Laura Parker and her younger brother Ethan spent most of their free time exploring the woods and fields around their home. It was an ordinary summer evening when they decided to venture further than usual, drawn by whispers of an old cornfield that had been abandoned for years. The air was warm, and the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the uneven rows of dried-up stalks. Ethan, always eager to prove he wasn't afraid of anything, led the way, his sneakers crunching against the dry earth. Laura followed, close behind, her arms crossed as she scanned the field with a mix of curiosity and unease. She didn't like this place. Something about it felt off, like the silence here was too heavy, too deliberate. Still, she couldn't bring herself to turn back. Not when Ethan was already several steps ahead, calling out for her to hurry up. "Come on, Laura," Ethan shouted, his voice carrying just enough confidence to mask any fear he might have felt. "You're so slow." Laura rolled her eyes but quickened her pace. "If we get lost out here, it's your fault," she said, though there wasn't much bite to her words. Despite her complaints, she enjoyed these little adventures with her brother. They were rare moments when the world felt big and mysterious instead of small and predictable. As they pushed deeper into the field, the light began to fade, painting everything in shades of orange and purple. That's when Ethan stopped abruptly, pointing at something half buried in the dirt. "What's that?" he asked, his voice quieter now, tinged with excitement rather than fear. Laura squinted, stepping closer to get a better look. At first glance, it looked like a rock or maybe part of an old farming tool, but as she knelt down, she realized it was neither. The object was smooth and metallic, unlike anything she'd ever seen before. It pulsed faintly with light, almost as if it were alive. Her heart raced as she reached out to touch it, ignoring the tiny voice in the back of her mind telling her not to. The moment her fingers brushed against the surface, the world seemed to shift. A blinding flash engulfed them, forcing both siblings to shield their eyes. For a split second, Laura thought she heard a sound, something between a hum and a whisper. But it was gone before she could make sense of it. When the light faded, they found themselves no longer standing in the cornfield. Instead, they were inside a vast, otherworldly structure. The walls glowed with soft, shifting colors, and strange symbols floated in the air like fireflies. Towering figures loomed nearby, watching them silently. These beings, tall and slender, with elongated limbs and translucent skin, were unlike anything Laura or Ethan had ever imagined. Their faces lacked features, yet somehow conveyed a sense of calm curiosity. One of the creatures stepped forward, extending a hand toward them. Though its movements were slow and deliberate, Laura instinctively took a step back, pulling Ethan closer to her side. But the being made no attempt to harm them. Instead, it projected an image directly into their minds, a vivid scene of Earth, but not as they knew it. Cities burned, oceans overflowed, and people screamed in chaos. Then, just as suddenly, the vision shifted to show acts of kindness. A stranger helping another carry groceries, children planting trees, families laughing together under the stars. It was overwhelming, like flipping through pages of a storybook filled with both beauty and horror. Laura felt tears welling up in her eyes, though she couldn't explain why. Ethan clung to her arm, his grip tight enough to leave marks. Neither of them spoke. Words felt useless in the face of what they were experiencing. Through fragmented thoughts and emotions, the beings, whom Laura would later learn were called the Veilith, communicated their purpose. Humanity fascinated them, but not in a good way. To the Veilith, humans were walking contradictions, capable of creating breathtaking art and technology while simultaneously destroying the very planet they depended on. They saw humanity's history as a series of cautionary tales, stories meant to teach lessons about greed, violence, and hubris. But the Veilith weren't storytellers in the traditional sense. They didn't speak with voices or write books. Instead, they absorbed information, piecing together narratives from the energy and memories of those they encountered. And now, standing before Laura and Ethan, they sought to understand more deeply. Why did humans act the way they did? Was there hope for change, Or were they doomed to repeat their mistakes? Before either sibling could process what was happening, the Valeth stepped back, their form shimmering slightly as if preparing to leave. Laura opened her mouth to ask questions, to beg for answers, but no sound came out. In another flash of light, the alien structure vanished, leaving them alone once again. Only this time, they weren't in the cornfield. They stood in their backyard, staring at the familiar outline of their house bathed in moonlight. Everything looked exactly as it had before, yet nothing felt the same. Laura glanced at Ethan, who stared back with wide, unblinking eyes. What just happened? He stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Laura shook her head, unsure how to respond. She didn't know what had happened, but one thing was certain. Their lives would never be the same again. When Laura and Ethan woke up the next morning, they weren't sure if what had happened the night before was real or just a strange dream. The sunlight streaming through their bedroom windows felt too ordinary, too normal, to match the surreal experience they'd shared. Yet as Ethan rubbed his eyes and sat up, he noticed something unusual, a faint hum in the back of his mind, like a distant echo that refused to fade. Laura felt it too, though she tried to ignore it at first. She went about her usual routine, brushing her teeth, making breakfast, and helping Ethan get ready for school. But the hum persisted, growing stronger whenever she thought about the towering beings and the glowing symbols. It wasn't painful, it was more like a reminder, as if the Valeth were still watching even from far away. At school, Laura found it hard to focus. Her teacher's voice droned on about history and math, but all she could think about was the vivid images the aliens had shown her. The burning cities, the overflowing oceans, the acts of kindness and cruelty. She couldn't shake the feeling that those scenes weren't random. They meant something. And worse, she couldn't stop wondering why the Valeth had chosen her and Ethan to witness them. After class, Laura met up with her best friend, Jake, who was leaning against his beat-up bike outside the school gates. Jake was tall for his age, with messy brown hair and a perpetual smirk that made him seem confident even when he wasn't. He was also practical to a fault, the kind of person who needed proof before believing anything out of the ordinary. "Hey," Jake said, pushing off the wall as Laura approached. "You look like you didn't sleep last night. Everything okay?" Laura hesitated, unsure how much to tell him. Jake wasn't the type to believe in aliens or mysterious glowing objects without solid evidence. But she needed someone to talk to, someone who wouldn't dismiss her outright. Taking a deep breath, she decided to test the waters. "Do you ever feel like something's watching you?" she asked, keeping her tone casual. Jake raised an eyebrow. "Like what? Your mom? Because I'm pretty sure she doesn't send me secret messages through the mail. No, I mean, something bigger, like not human." Jake stared at her for a moment, then burst out laughing. "Okay, seriously, what's going on? Did you watch too many sci-fi movies or something?" Laura sighed, realizing she'd have to be more direct. "Last night, Ethan and I found something weird in the old cornfield. This thing. It was round and shiny, and when I touched it, everything changed. We ended up somewhere else, with aliens." Jake stopped laughing immediately. His expression shifted from amusement to skepticism. "Aliens? Really? You're messing with me, right?" "I'm not," Laura insisted. "I know it sounds crazy, but it's true. They showed us stuff, pictures of Earth, like stories or warnings or something. And now I can't stop thinking about it." For a moment, Jake just looked at her, his brow furrowed. Then he shrugged. "All right, fine. Prove it." Laura knew she couldn't prove anything. Not yet. But she didn't give up. Over the next few days, she kept bringing it up, sharing bits and pieces of her story until Jake reluctantly agreed to go with her and Ethan to the cornfield. Part of him still thought it was a prank, but another part, the curious part, wanted to see for himself. When they arrived at the field, the air felt different, heavier somehow. The dried-up stalks swayed slightly in the breeze, and the ground seemed untouched, as if no one had been there in years. But Ethan didn't hesitate. He led them straight to the spot where they'd found the object, pointing at the patch of dirt. "It was here," he said, his voice steady, despite the nervous energy radiating off him. Right here. Jake crouched down, running his fingers through the soil. Looks like regular dirt to me, he muttered. No shiny alien balls. Laura frowned, frustration bubbling inside her. She'd hoped coming back would trigger something. Another flash of light, a sign, anything. But nothing happened. Just as Jake was about to stand up and declare the whole thing a waste of time, something caught his eye. A perfect circle of flattened stalks stretched out behind them, forming intricate patterns in the ground. The design was symmetrical, impossibly precise and unlike anything any of them had seen before. Jake's jaw dropped as he stared at it, his earlier skepticism crumbling. "What is that?" he whispered, stepping closer. "I don't know," Laura admitted, her heart pounding, "but I think it's connected." As they stood there trying to make sense of the crop circle, a low hum filled the air. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable, vibrating through their chests and making the hairs on their arms stand up. Laura recognized it instantly. It was the same sound she'd been hearing in her mind since the night of their encounter. Ethan grabbed her arm, his grip tight. "They're here," he said, his voice trembling. "I can feel it." Before Laura could respond, the hum grew louder, and a series of whispers echoed around them. The voices, if that's what they were, didn't speak in words. Instead, they conveyed emotions, curiosity, caution, and something else Laura couldn't quite name. It was as if the Veilith were communicating directly with them, bypassing language entirely. Jake took a step back, his face pale. "Okay, this is officially freaky. What do we do?" "We wait," Laura said, surprising even herself with how calm she sounded. Deep down, she knew the Veilith weren't hostile. They were observers, learners, trying to understand humanity in ways that defied explanation. Over the next few days, strange things began happening around town. Lights appeared in the sky, hovering silently above rooftops before vanishing without a trace. People reported hearing faint humming sounds late at night, and some claimed to see shadowy figures moving through the fields. At first, most dismissed these events as tricks of the light or overactive imaginations. But as the sightings increased, fear started to spread. Laura noticed subtle changes in the people around her. Neighbors who once argued over noise complaints or property lines suddenly greeted each other warmly. Local businesses started prioritizing eco-friendly practices, and community gardens sprang up in empty lots. Even Jake, who used to mock environmental activists, began volunteering at a recycling center saying he wanted to do his part. But not everyone reacted positively. Some groups saw the Veilith's presence as a threat, interpreting their actions as surveillance or preparation for invasion. One man, Richard Dawson, emerged as a vocal critic, rallying supporters under the banner of Earth First. He organized protests, gave fiery speeches, and called for armed resistance against the unknown. "Those things aren't here to help us," Richard shouted during one rally, his voice amplified by a megaphone. "They're spying on us, studying us like lab rats. If we don't fight back, they'll take everything we've built." His words resonated with many, fueling anger and paranoia. Tensions rose as pro-Veilith and anti-Veilith factions clashed, turning once peaceful streets into battlegrounds of rhetoric and fear. Caught between hope and chaos, Laura struggled to find balance. She knew the Veilith weren't evil, but she couldn't deny the unrest spreading across her town, and beyond. With Jake's help, she resolved to uncover more about the aliens' intentions, hoping to bridge the gap between fear and understanding. Meanwhile, Ethan continued sketching the symbols he remembered from their encounter, filling notebooks with swirling patterns and shapes. Each drawing seemed to resonate with him on a deeper level, as if connecting him to something vast and incomprehensible. Laura watched him work, sensing that her little brother was becoming more than just a witness. He was evolving into a link between two worlds. As the days turned into weeks, the presence of the Veilith became impossible to ignore. Strange lights continued to appear in the skies above towns and cities worldwide, glowing softly before disappearing without a trace. Governments scrambled to respond, deploying scientists, military personnel, and even conspiracy theorists to investigate. Yet every attempt to communicate or interfere ended in failure. The Veilith remained elusive, choosing observation over confrontation. Laura watched, as her small town and the world grappled with the reality of their existence. Some people embraced the changes brought on by the aliens' arrival, finding inspiration in the idea that humanity was being studied and perhaps judged. Others, however, grew more fearful and resistant. Richard Dawson's Earth First movement gained momentum, drawing supporters who believed that humanity should defend itself against what they saw as an alien invasion. Protests erupted in streets across the country, dividing communities and turning neighbors against one another. Caught in the middle of it all, Laura felt torn. She knew the Veilith weren't inherently evil. They were curious, cautious, and maybe even hopeful about humanity's potential. But she couldn't deny the growing unrest around her. Every news report showed images of clashes between pro-Veilith, groups advocating for peace, and anti-Veilith factions calling for war. It was as if the entire planet was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Ethan, meanwhile, became increasingly absorbed in his drawings. He spent hours sketching the symbols he remembered from their encounter, filling notebook after notebook with intricate patterns. Laura noticed that each drawing seemed to affect him differently, sometimes calming him, other times leaving him restless and agitated. One evening, as she peeked into his room, she saw him staring intently at a particularly complex design, his eyes wide with concentration. "What are you doing?" she asked gently, stepping inside. "I'm trying to understand," Ethan replied, without looking up. "These symbols, they mean something, I can feel it." Laura sat down beside him, studying the page. The symbols looked like nothing she'd ever seen before, swirling lines and shapes that seemed to pulse with energy, even on paper. "Do you think they're messages from the Veilith?" Ethan nodded slowly. "Maybe. Or maybe they're keys." "Keys to? I don't know. Something important?" His words sent a chill down Laura's spine. She wanted to believe that Ethan's connection to the Veilith could lead to answers, but the thought of him becoming more deeply involved terrified her. What if the Veilith's influence grew too strong? What if they used him for purposes she couldn't comprehend? The next day, Laura shared her concerns with Jake, who had become a steady source of support. They met at the edge of the cornfield, where the mysterious crop circle still lay untouched. Jake leaned against a tree, his arms crossed as he listened to her worries. "You think Ethan's changing because of them?" he asked, his tone serious for once. "I don't know," Laura admitted, "but something's happening to him. He talks about the symbols like they're alive, like they're talking back to him." Jake frowned, glancing toward the horizon. "If the Veilith really are watching us, maybe we need to figure out how to talk to them ourselves, instead of waiting for them to make the next move." Laura stared at him, surprised by the suggestion. "How would we even do that?" "We start with what we know," Jake said firmly. "Ethan's drawings, that thing in the field, whatever weird hums and whispers we've been hearing. If we put it all together, maybe we can send a message back." Though skeptical, Laura couldn't deny the logic in Jake's plan. For weeks they worked tirelessly, piecing together fragments of information. Ethan provided the symbols, sketching them onto large sheets of paper, while Laura and Jake experimented with ways to replicate the hum they'd heard during their encounters. Using spare parts from Jake's dad's auto shop, they built a makeshift device, a crude contraption of wires, speakers, and batteries designed to emit frequencies similar to those associated with the Veilith. It wasn't perfect, but it was the best they could do with limited resources. On a clear night under a sky filled with stars, they returned to the cornfield to test their invention. The air was cool, and the only sound came from the rustling leaves overhead. Laura's heart raced as she helped Jake set up the machine, positioning it in the center of the crop circle. "Ready?" Jake asked, flipping a switch. At first, nothing happened. The machine emitted a low buzz, barely audible over the wind. But then, as they adjusted the frequency, the hum grew louder, vibrating through the ground beneath their feet. Ethan stood nearby, clutching one of his notebooks tightly, his eyes fixed on the device. Suddenly, the atmosphere shifted. A bright light descended from the sky, illuminating the field in a golden glow. Laura shielded her eyes, squinting as the massive shape of a Valith ship materialized above them. It hovered silently, its surface shimmering like liquid metal. "They're here," Ethan whispered, his voice trembling with awe. The Valith didn't waste time. Within moments, several of the tall, translucent beings emerged from the ship, their forms glowing faintly in the darkness. They moved gracefully, their movements deliberate yet unhurried. As they approached, Laura felt the now familiar sensation of thoughts and emotions flooding her mind. Not intrusive, but overwhelming in their clarity. Through this mental connection, the Valith acknowledged Ethan's efforts. They projected images into his mind, showing him scenarios of Earth's possible futures. In some visions, humanity thrived, living in harmony with nature and technology. In others, the planet burned, consumed by greed and conflict. Each scene carried a weight that left Ethan breathless, tears streaming down his face. When the visions subsided, the Valith delivered a message, not in words but in feelings and impressions. They admired humanity's resilience and creativity, but feared its capacity for destruction. If humans continued down their current path, the Valith warned, they would have no choice but to intervene more forcefully. However, if humanity chose to change, if it embraced balance and cooperation, the Valith offered guidance and resources to help ensure a brighter future. The encounter lasted only a few minutes, but it felt like hours. When the Valith returned to their ship and ascended into the sky, the field fell silent once again. Laura, Jake, and Ethan stood frozen, processing what had just happened. Jake trailed off, unable to find the right words. "Real," Laura finished for him. Her voice was steady, though her hands shook slightly. "And we need to tell people. We need to show them there's another way." Ethan nodded, clutching his notebook tighter. "We can't let fear win," he said quietly. "Not when we have a chance to fix things." Over the following days, Laura, Jake, and Ethan dedicated themselves to spreading the Valith's message. They traveled across the region, sharing their story with anyone who would listen. At first, many dismissed them as delusional or attention-seeking. But as they spoke passionately about the visions and the aliens' warnings, some began to take notice. Their efforts sparked grassroots movements focused on unity, sustainability, and peace. Community leaders organized forums to discuss ways to address environmental issues and social inequalities. Schools introduced programs teaching empathy and cooperation. Even local businesses started prioritizing ethical practices, inspired by the idea that humanity could rise above its flaws. Richard Dawson and his followers tried to undermine their work, accusing them of collaborating with the invaders. Protests turned violent at times, with clashes breaking out between opposing sides. Despite the danger, Laura refused to back down. She knew the risks, but she also knew the stakes. One evening, as she stood on the porch of their home, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, Laura felt a sense of hope she hadn't experienced in weeks. Beside her, Jake leaned against the railing, his expression thoughtful. "You think we can actually pull this off?" he asked. "I don't know," Laura admitted, "but we have to try. For Ethan, for everyone." Behind them, Ethan played quietly in the yard, his laughter carrying on the breeze. Above, a single streak of light crossed the horizon, a reminder that the Valith were still watching, waiting to see what humanity would choose. For the first time in a long while, Laura allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could become something better than the nightmare the Valith had once feared. The message Laura, Jake, and Ethan carried wasn't easy to share. At first, it felt like shouting into a storm. People were scared, angry, or simply unwilling to listen. Richard Dawson and his followers worked tirelessly to discredit them, spreading rumors that the trio had been brainwashed by the Valith. Protesters gathered outside their home, holding signs that read, "No aliens, no lies, and Earth belongs to humans. The tension in the town grew thicker with each passing day. Despite the hostility, Laura refused to give up. She knew the Valith's warning was real, and she believed humanity still had a chance to change. With Jake's help, she organized meetings in community centers, schools, and even parks. They spoke about what they'd seen, the visions of Earth's potential futures, and urged people to focus on kindness, sustainability, and cooperation. Slowly but surely, their words began to resonate. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day of speaking at a local high school, Laura sat on the steps outside the building, staring at the stars. Jake joined her, handing over a bottle of water. "You okay?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. "I don't know," Laura admitted, taking a sip. "Sometimes I feel like we're making progress. Other times it feels like we're just spinning our wheels." Jake nodded, looking out at the quiet parking lot. "Change doesn't happen overnight, but you're doing something important. You're giving people hope." Laura smiled faintly, grateful for his support. It wasn't just her and Jake anymore. Ethan had become an integral part of their efforts too. Though he was younger, his connection to the Valith gave him a unique perspective. He often accompanied them to events, drawing symbols from memory and explaining how they represented balance and harmony. His innocence and sincerity touched many hearts, especially those who doubted the authenticity of their story. As weeks passed, the movement gained momentum. More people started paying attention, inspired by the idea that humanity could rewrite its future. Local businesses began adopting greener practices, families planted trees in empty lots, and neighbors helped one another in ways they hadn't before. Even skeptics found themselves drawn to the sense of purpose the message brought, but not everyone was ready to embrace change. Richard Dawson remained a vocal opponent, rallying his followers with fiery speeches that painted the Valith as invaders, bent on domination. His rhetoric grew more extreme, urging people to take up arms and defend Earth. Some listened, forming militias and stockpiling weapons. Tensions escalated, leading to clashes between pro-Valith groups and anti-Valith factions. One night, as Laura and Jake prepared for another meeting, a group of protesters showed up outside the community center. They shouted insults, waved banners, and blocked the entrance, preventing anyone from attending. Laura stood on the steps, her hands trembling as she faced the angry crowd. Jake moved closer to her, ready to step in if things turned violent. "Go home," one man yelled, pointing at her. "We don't need your alien lies." Laura took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. "I'm not here to lie," she said, raising her voice so everyone could hear. "I'm here because I care about this planet, and about all of us. The Valith aren't our enemies. They're showing us what we could lose if we don't change." Her words seemed to quiet the crowd for a moment, but Richard stepped forward, his face twisted with anger. "That's exactly what they want you to think," he shouted. "They're tricking you, manipulating you. Wake up before it's too late." The argument continued, growing louder and more heated. Just as it seemed like things might spiral out of control, a soft hum filled the air. Everyone froze, turning their heads toward the sky. A beam of golden light descended, illuminating the street in front of the community center. The Valith ship hovered silently above, its presence undeniable. For a few seconds, no one moved. Then, slowly, the crowd began to disperse, some muttering under their breath, others staring in awe. Richard glared at the ship, his fists clenched, but even he didn't dare approach it. As the light faded and the ship disappeared, Laura felt a mix of relief and frustration. The Valith had intervened again, but she wished they wouldn't have to. Back at home, Ethan sat at the kitchen table, sketching new symbols in his notebook. Laura watched him, noticing how absorbed he was in his work. "How are you feeling?" she asked gently. Ethan looked up, his expression thoughtful. "Like I'm supposed to do something," he said, "but I don't know what yet." Laura placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're already doing so much. Without you, none of this would be possible." Ethan nodded, though doubt lingered in his eyes. Over time, his connection to the Valith had grown stronger, sometimes leaving him exhausted or overwhelmed. Laura worried about him, but she also knew he was the key to bridging the gap between humans and aliens. A few days later, Laura received an invitation to speak at a larger event in the city. Organizers hoped her story could inspire even more people to join the movement. Though nervous, she agreed, knowing it was an opportunity to reach a wider audience. Jake came along, helping her prepare, while Ethan stayed behind with their parents, who were becoming increasingly concerned about the risks involved. The event took place in a large auditorium packed with people eager to hear her speak. As Laura stood on stage looking out at the sea of faces, she felt a surge of determination. She shared her experience honestly, describing the Veilith's arrival, the visions they'd shown her, and the message they carried. When she finished, the room erupted in applause and dozens of people lined up to ask questions or express their gratitude. Among the attendees was a scientist named Dr. Emily Grant, who approached Laura after the talk. "Your story is remarkable," she said, her tone earnest. "If there's any way I can help, whether it's analyzing data or finding ways to communicate with the Veilith, I'd like to offer my assistance." Laura thanked her, feeling a renewed sense of hope. For the first time, it seemed like they weren't alone in this fight. As months passed, the influence of the Veilith became less direct. Sightings of their ships grew rare, and the hum that had lingered in Laura and Ethan's minds faded almost completely. It was as if the Veilith were stepping back, allowing humanity to take responsibility for its actions. But their impact remained. Communities around the world continued working toward positive change, driven by the vision of a better future. Schools taught lessons about environmental stewardship, companies adopted sustainable practices, and governments collaborated on global initiatives. While challenges persisted, the shift in mindset was undeniable. Richard Dawson's movement lost steam as fear gave way to hope. Though he and his followers still held protests, fewer people attended, and their voices carried less weight. Even Richard himself seemed to soften over time, though he never publicly admitted defeat. Laura, Jake, and Ethan kept sharing their story, traveling to new places and meeting people from all walks of life. Each encounter reinforced their belief that humanity had the power to rise above its flaws, if only it chose to try. One evening, as they stood together in the cornfield where it all began, now transformed into a lush sanctuary teeming with life, Laura felt a deep sense of peace. Above them, a single streak of light crossed the sky, a reminder of the bond forged between two species and the lessons learned along the way. For the first time in centuries, humanity dared to dream of a future free from fear, a future where they might finally stop being the nightmare and start becoming the light. Years passed, and the world began to heal. The changes sparked by Laura, Jake, and Ethan's efforts rippled outward, touching lives in ways no one could have predicted. Cities once choked with smog now breathed cleaner air, thanks to renewable energy projects and stricter regulations. Forests that had been stripped bare were replanted, their greenery reclaiming the land. People learned to work together, setting aside old grudges and fears to build something stronger, a future worth fighting for. Laura grew into a young woman known for her determination and compassion. She traveled across the globe sharing her story and inspiring others to keep pushing for change. Her talks drew crowds of all ages, from children eager to learn about the Veilith to elders who remembered a time when hope felt scarce. Though she sometimes missed the quiet life she'd once known, she couldn't imagine doing anything else. This was her purpose now, to remind humanity of its potential. Jake stayed by her side, his skepticism long replaced by unwavering support. He handled the practical side of things, organizing events, managing logistics, and keeping Laura grounded when the pressure became too much. Over time, he even started giving speeches of his own, focusing on how small actions, like fixing a bike instead of buying a new one or planting a single tree, could add up to big differences. His straightforward approach resonated with people, especially those who doubted their ability to make an impact. Ethan, now a teenager, had grown quieter but no less important. His connection to the Veilith remained strong, though it no longer overwhelmed him. He continued drawing symbols, filling notebooks with intricate patterns that seemed to glow with meaning. Some scientists studied his work, hoping to decipher the messages hidden within, but Ethan always insisted they were more than just codes. They were feelings, ideas, glimpses of something vast and beautiful. Though the Veilith themselves had retreated, their presence lingered in subtle ways. Occasionally, someone would report seeing a ship in the sky or hearing a faint hum, but these encounters were rare and fleeting. It was as if the aliens were content to observe from afar, satisfied that humanity was finally taking responsibility for its actions. One evening, Laura returned to the cornfield where it all began. Now transformed into a sanctuary, the area teemed with life. Wildflowers bloomed among the tall grasses and birds chirped happily in the trees that had been planted there years ago. She stood at the edge of the field, watching the sunset paint, the sky in hues of orange and pink. Behind her, Jake approached carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to her, smiling softly. "You okay?" he asked, his voice gentle. "I'm fine," Laura replied, sipping the warm drink. "Just thinking." "About what?" "Everything," she admitted. "How far we've come, how much farther. We still have to go." Jake nodded, gazing out at the field. "It's not perfect, but it's better. And that's something." They stood in silence for a while, enjoying the peaceful moment. Then, in the distance, they heard laughter. Turning, they saw Ethan playing with his young daughter, Lily. She chased after a butterfly, her giggles echoing through the air. Ethan knelt beside her, pointing out shapes in the clouds, his face alight with joy. Laura smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. For so long she'd carried the weight of the Veilith's message, afraid of what might happen if humanity failed. But now, seeing her brother and his child, she allowed herself to believe in the possibility of a brighter future. Later that night, as the stars filled the sky, Laura lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. The hum, the faint echo of the Veilith's presence, was gone now, leaving only memories. Yet she didn't feel abandoned. Instead, she felt grateful. The aliens had given humanity a chance to prove itself, and slowly but surely, people were rising to the challenge. The next morning, Laura woke early, determined to start the day with purpose. She met Jake and Ethan for breakfast at a small cafe in town. The 3 of them sat outside, enjoying the crisp autumn air as leaves drifted lazily to the ground. "You know," Jake said between bites of toast, "I never thought I'd say this, but I'm glad we found that thing in the field." Ethan grinned, nudging him playfully. "Me too, even if it scared me half to death." Laura laughed, shaking her head. "Honestly, I think it scared all of us. But look where we are now." Jake leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Yeah, look at us. Saving the world, one step at a time." They spent the rest of the day exploring the town, revisiting places that held special meaning for them. They stopped by the community garden where Jake had volunteered years ago, now thriving with vegetables and flowers. They visited the high school where Laura had given her first speech, its walls covered in murals celebrating unity and hope. Everywhere they went, they saw signs of progress, proof that humanity was capable of change. As evening fell, they returned to the cornfield one last time. Standing together, they looked up at the sky, searching for any sign of the Veilith. Though none appeared, Laura felt certain they were watching, waiting to see what humanity would do next. "We did it," Ethan said quietly, breaking the silence. "We showed them we're not just a nightmare." Laura reached out, squeezing his hand. "No, we didn't just show them. We proved it to ourselves too." For a moment, none of them spoke. Then, as if on cue, a shooting star streaked across the horizon, leaving a trail of light in its wake. Laura closed her eyes, making a silent wish, for peace, for understanding, for a world where humanity could truly shine. When she opened her eyes again, Jake and Ethan were smiling at her. "What?" she asked, laughing. "Nothing," Jake said, shrugging. "Just thinking about how far we've come and how much farther we can go." Laura nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she knew they weren't alone. Together they had faced fear, doubt, and division, and emerged stronger for it. As they walked away from the field, hand in hand, Laura glanced back one final time. The golden glow of the setting sun bathed the sanctuary in light, casting long shadows across the ground. In that moment she felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for the Valeth, but for the resilience and courage of humanity itself. For the first time in centuries, the nightmare was fading, and in its place, a new story was being written, one of hope, balance, and endless possibility.